How do gemstones form? Rare environmental conditions come together at the right time and place. Diamonds aren't going to form in rhyolite. You're not going to find aquamarine in the conglomerates along the Columbia River. Heat, pressure, and the right mixture of elements have to coalesce in just the right way to create precious gemstones. The garnet species uvarovite needs calcium, chromium, and silicon in the right proportions and oxidation states to become a green gemstone and not a yellow cancer hazard. Feldspars are the most common mineral on Earth, yet translucent gem-quality sunstones are extremely rare. Heat and pressure. Is that all it takes to make a gemstone? In that case, throw some coal in the Instant Pot and fire it up. Unfortunately, it isn't nearly this easy, but the allure and value of gemstones means we've been working on creating them for a long, long time. There's a great book by Kurt Nassau called Gems Made by Man that details the many successes and failures of synthesizing gemstones throughout history. I got a copy and was surprised to see that in 1903, the coastal town of Hoquiam, Washington, was the first production site of lab-grown rubies in the United States. And the main proprietors of this venture were two lumbermen named Poulsen and Ninemeyer. It seemed so strange that this little lumber town on the Pacific coast, which had only officially become a town 13 years prior, could house the process of gemstone growth that I had until then only associated with big industrial facilities. Kurt's main source for this section was cited as an article in a 1973 Lapidary Journal magazine, also written by Kurt. And since then, nothing. Every subsequent mention of this tidbit of history only cites Kurt's work, if they bother to cite sources at all. The only reason the ruby enterprise was allegedly attempted in Hoquiam was because of the creation of the Verneuil furnace by Frenchman Auguste Victor Louis Verneuil.
In the early research and development of sapphire and ruby production, there were two big competing thoughts. One was the melting point's too high, so we've got to dissolve it in something else and then crystallize it back out. And that were people like Fremy in like the late 1800s. And then you've got the people who say, well, no, we know how to melt it. Like we know what the melting point should be. We just don't have good ways of doing this in bulk. So let's try to scale up melting the like powdered feedstock. And that was Verneuil.
In 1902, Verneuil announced he'd developed a new method to synthesize rubies. He held off on publishing the process until 1904, but then how was it that rubies were being made 5,000 miles away in 1903? To answer this question, we'll spend the next 45 minutes digging. It was his lab assistant. One of his lab assistants was probably temporarily hired away to share the process. I say probably because A, I've been instilled with the need to qualify everything I write, more or less, and B, the evidence is quaternary. I'm referencing Nassau, who in the 70s referenced a jeweler named Marcher, who got his information in the 30s from another jeweler named Straub, who obtained rubies maybe from Poulsen or Ninemeyer. Many details have been lost in this game of gemological telephone, and to try and work it all out, we need to know who all's been on the line. Dr. Kurt Nassau was a powerhouse in the world of synthetic gemstones. He worked for AT&T Bell Laboratories for most of his career, and actually performed many of the crystal growth experiments and treatments we deal with today. His many books on crystal growth, color, and treatments are still well regarded, and in some cases remain the de facto resource.
There's an old text with the 13 causes of color in gemstones, or something like that. And then if you look at Gems Made by Man, and you look at Gemstone Enhancement Volume 2, all of those are Nassau books that are, like, they hold up pretty well. Yeah, like nowadays we know that the actual causes of color are a little bit more complicated than his descriptions, but his descriptions are still fairly, like, high-level accurate. That is all still valid stuff, and they're great primers for somebody who wants to like read into it more.
For the 1973 article on the Hoquiam Ruby, Nassau borrowed several of the original rubies for analysis. But from what I gather, Nassau didn't work directly with Marcher, but obtained his samples from various institutions like the National Museum, now the Smithsonian, the London Gemological Laboratory, now GEMA, I think, and private collectors. But they all likely acquired their pieces from Marcher, so who was he? George H. Marcher was a California-based jeweler and one of the first graduates of the Gemological Institute of America, or GIA. He authored many articles on gemstones and gemology, and apparently learned of the Hoquiam rubies around 1935. According to Nassau, he immediately bought them all up and later sold many, although he would dispose of nearly 100 products, keeping only about 22. In 1973, Nassau was only able to track down 6 rubies. and it doesn't appear that any more have come to light since then. Marcher published a brief article about the rubies in 1938, having acquired all he could from Fred Straub. Straub, for his part, was a well-regarded jeweler based out of Hoquiam, having moved there around the turn of the century from Minnesota. So he was certainly well placed to acquire the rubies from Poulsen and Ninemeyer. Although Nassau and Marcher refer to them as Hoquiam rubies, we can't say for certain that they were made in Hoquiam and not a neighboring town like Aberdeen or, as we'll see, maybe further afield. Marcher reported that it was the mysterious French chemist who initiated the venture, with the lumbermen Poulsen and Ninemeyer providing the capital to the tune of several $1,000s. The synthesis of gem-quality ruby has a long history, at times scientific and at others devious. Occasionally, new methods of ruby synthesis were made with the products passed off as the real thing. Verneuil, on the other hand, was always above board. His methods, or at least announcements of his progress, were frequently made at the French Academy of Sciences. In 1892, he filed a secret letter outlining the process of Verneuil growth, and worked to perfect it over the next decade. In 1902, he announced his progress, but would only publicly publish the process 2 years later in 1904. Reports of the method quickly spread in the States, appearing in newspapers at least by July of that year. Now, there is a question of timing here. Nassau reported having labels reading about 1903 and 1904 for the synthetic rubies he located. Marcher wrote that it was 1904 when the mysterious chemist succeeded in creating the Hoquiam rubies. Now, there must have been some lead time to convince Poulsen and Ninemeyer of the prospects and to acquire the necessary equipment and laboratory space. It seems likely that the groundwork was being laid before 1904, but from this, whether the chemist actually used insider knowledge or whether he was going off of the formally published process isn't cut and dried. But now enter the story Horace G. Byers. Dr. Byers was a professor of chemistry at the University of Washington in Seattle. While trying to find any reference to Hoquiam Ruby, which is impossible, I found an odd note in a small Eastern Washington newspaper, the Colfax Gazette. In it, 2 French chemists in Seattle were reportedly working with Byers to produce ruby in 1905. Now, what are the odds that 2 unrelated attempts at this novel form of ruby synthesis were centered on the Washington coast, especially with both involving French chemists? Maybe the odds are good. After all, the Verneuil process, also known as flame fusion, seemingly promised cheap, fast production of rubies. It's probably time we talk about what that process actually is. The flame fusion process of sapphire growth was a remarkable achievement. It was so simple yet effective that a Verneuil furnace produced today will use essentially the same procedure as in the early 1900s. The main improvements, I think, are in instrument tolerances, electrical stability, things like that. But even back then, Verneuil was able to very quickly produce pounds of ruby. So the question is, how? Heat. You melt aluminum, you get a ruby. I can't believe it took them centuries to come up with that. No, but seriously, the basic operation of the Verneuil furnace is to very slowly add a mixture of purified alumina and chromium powder, chromium being the coloring agent in real rubies, onto a platform in the hot zone of an oxoacetylene torch, with the temperature being above 2000 degrees Celsius. Simultaneously, the platform is slowly lowered out of the hot zone, allowing the molten alumina to crystallize into sapphire, which is just alumina oxide. The process creates a cone of sintered aluminum, and then at the tip, it starts to melt, and the ruby grows in an inverted cone until reaching a maximum width dependent on the interior dimensions.
They kind of moved on from that. So instead of little hammers that tap, like little vibrating apparatus, so that it's a consistent vibration and you get very consistent, even feedstock dripping through. The ability to swap out different feedstocks. So that's how you get those bicolor sapphires that are in production now. So you've got the feedstock pouring through. Well, okay, 20 minutes in, you just swap out the container with another container that has a different formula in it. Better control over the gas flows that go in. So for traditional sapphire growth, it's oxygen and hydrogen in a certain ratio. But if you change that ratio, you can either get a hotter flame, which lets you make other stuff. You can control the oxygen conditions, which are really important for changing the charge state in your coloring agents. So if you look at cobalt, for example, cobalt 3 in sapphire, bright green. Cobalt 2 in sapphire, blue. So being able to change out that flame was a big advancement. And then the specifics of the pedestal and how the pedestal moves up and down and how the pedestal spins and the insulation around it. Because all of that, those improvements allowed people to go from boules that were the size of your pinky to 30 millimeter long rods.
Modern boules are usually several inches long, but early products didn't extend much beyond the Hershey's Kiss stage size range. In addition to their squat nature, these early boules often share other characteristics, like more obvious curved growth lines, cracks, and discontinuous bands due to slight irregularities in feed rate, heat, and so on.
The way you can think about those lines is kind of like stalagmites and stalactites. If you've got stuff constantly dripping in layers that kind of stacks on top of here, if you're able to get that powder, that like the powder flowing through the flame, perfectly even, perfectly consistent, all at the same rate, then you'll have like just a continuous growth. But if it's intermittent, if you've got like a little, like a wave of stuff that falls on there, and then another wave of stuff that falls on there, and another wave of stuff that falls on there, that produces literal like layers that are stacked on top of each other. So it's like the difference between one of those vibrating things where it's just constant stream of powder that gets melted versus the hammer, where the hammer like taps like however many times a second and that produces layers. For like a 5-second period, little bit too much oxygen, little bit not enough oxygen. Then the charge on whatever you've added in there could be a little bit different. Like maybe you get a little bit of, I don't know, iron 2 instead of iron 3. Whoever, doesn't matter. But slightly different conditions over a couple of seconds produces layers.
However, because the intent is to produce clean gemstones, there's not really any characteristics that can be used to distinguish boules made in France from those made in the States. Oh, and by the way, they're called boules because these early products were all kind of ball or globe-like. Long boules, due to their internal strain, crack fairly neatly in either two by themselves or with a directed blow just after cooling. If they aren't quickly halved, they can crack up entirely.
Modern production can produce complete boules in like a couple of hours. The problem with that is that the faster you grow it, the more internal strain it'll have. And all like synthetic sapphire has some degree of internal strain, which is part of why it's always split. It relieves all the internal strain. But if you were to grow it very slowly with like extremely strictly controlled conditions, sure, it's going to take you a couple of days instead of a couple of hours. But then your crystal is going to have far fewer like bubbles in it. It's going to have better pleochroism. It'll have less internal strain and won't need to be split, stuff like that.
And I haven't really pressed on how finicky this ruby production can be, which relies on stable conditions of heat, oxygen flow, electricity, other gases, powder introduction, platform lowering, and more. It took years for Verneuil to get things right. Now imagine yourself having read the 30-page process cold and having to get all the parameters exactly correct for the first time. It's going to take some practice, which is why the French chemists that assisted Verneuil were primed to hit the ground running. The story by Marcher and Nassau goes like this. Poulsen and Ninemeyer worked with a French chemist in or around Hoquiam to grow synthetic ruby. Who approached who isn't clear. Nassau made it seem like Poulsen hired the chemist away from France. Marcher seemed to think that the chemist sought out funding here in the Washington coast. Why here? Who knows? Either way, they were successful, sort of, growing ruby, but only small boules, cutting less than like 5-carat stones. They then had to send those stones to New York for cutting, then get the samples back before sending them back out for sale. The small return and all the travel logistics were too much, and they shut down, with Poulsen or maybe Ninemeyer selling the stock of rubies to Straub somewhere down the line. And that's the way the story's been told for 51 years. But here's what really happened. French immigrant Paul Richards was living in Seattle at the turn of the century, working for the streetcar company. He had a cousin, Auguste Ariste Richards, back in France, who worked as a chemist and professor, and who had a friend named Dorothy who worked in the city chemistry lab in Paris. Ariste contacted his cousin in early 1903, before Verneuil formally published his process, and pitched a radical new idea about growing gemstones. It took a trip to Paris for Paul to see the potential, and he brought back stones to convince his financiers of the scheme. The money bags behind the endeavor aren't named, but without any contrary information, we can, I guess, slot Poulsen and Ninemeyer into frame here. In late 1904, Dorothy and Ariste immigrated to the United States with a few machines, initially setting up shop in Paul's basement. They had trouble right away with securing the quality and amount of oxygen needed to run these machines, which use over 100 liters of oxygen per carat, with the typical sizes requiring something like 1,500 liters in total per stone. Still running into problems, they asked University of Washington chemistry professor Horace G. Byers for assistance, and he helped them discover their hydrogen gas source was the wrong kind. They soon moved to the basement of the Idaho Saloon, now the Booty Building, on the corner of 5th and Jackson in downtown Seattle, where they finally achieved quality ruby synthesis. The operation moved again to Everett before July of 1906. Marcher chalked up the end of production to issues with growth and travel logistics. Maybe that was the case, but in 1906, Richards said a New York company was looking to buy out production. This was maybe wishful thinking or a ploy to increase interest because in 1907, Richards pitched the company to Bellingham investors, noting their gas was purer than Everett's and would make better rubies. He pitched to the Young Men's Commercial Club for $25,000, offering shares of his company at 10 apiece, promising 4,000 rubies a month. I guess there weren't enough takers, but it's fun to think Bellingham was almost the synthetic ruby capital of the US. In 1905, in the midst of their experiments, Paul Richards identified his occupation as capitalist. By 1910, however, he was back in Tacoma working as a promoter for a photography company, while also working with French banks overseas to invest in Western Washington. So clearly the days of ruby synthesis were behind him. Paul later worked in the movie business, likely in a photography-related capacity. He was drafted for service in World War I as an Army photographer, stationed in Alabama for a time before being sent overseas. Unfortunately, he died in 1921 as a result of complications from exposure to mustard gas. His cousin Ariste was reportedly a university professor in Tacoma in 1920 and appears to have passed away around 1927. Dorsey lived his days in King County, working as a roadway engineer and later a consulting engineer. Major open questions are how Paul Richards financed the work and why Poulsen and Ninemeyer appear in Straub's story if they weren't financiers. Whether they were or not, we need ways to connect the trio. The most obvious link I've found is in Richards' photography interests, which didn't only materialize after the Ruby venture ended. Although he listed himself as a Tacoma streetcar employee in the 1900 census, by 1903 at least, he and his wife were down in Montesano, just 15 miles from Hoquiam, working as partners in the photography firm Aldrich and Richards. Some of their photographs are with the Poulsen Museum, like these from the lumber mills in the area. Obviously, Paul would have known about Poulsen Lumber, the biggest logging company in the area. Also in 1903, Paul was also on the board of the Tacoma and Chelan Mining and Milling Company, which offered stock on the Paris Bourse, their stock exchange. Since Poulsen would later diversify into mining, perhaps he had some interest in gems and minerals and would be willing to invest. If they were the financiers, then I could see Poulsen keeping the stock of boules as part of their investment. However, with Paul having his fingers in so many pies, perhaps he didn't need financing after all. Except in the 1906 article, he does mention having partners to convince. But if they weren't Poulsen or Ninemeyer, then it's possible that after Paul passed away, his wife was left with a stock of uncut gems and someone like Poulsen was willing to buy them all, selling to Straub later. It's very easy to lose the context of a mineral sample without careful record keeping. However Straub acquired the gemstones, he must not have gotten the full story. Marcher, with maybe just a little to go on, assumed the rubies were made in Hoquiam, the site of Fred's business and source of much of the fortune of Poulsen and Ninemeyer. And what should be called the Seattle Ruby, or maybe the Everett Ruby, would be forever known as Hoquiam Ruby. Either way, Washington State remains as the first producer of synthetic rubies in the United States. Now, I guess I need to be clear, I could be wrong about this connection. Maybe there were two independent ruby synthesis experiments going on in Washington State, but my counter-argument is, well, come on, what are the odds? In trying to track down these boules today, let's just say I've done my due diligence. The Gemological Institute of America has one boule, a gift from Kurt Nassau, and I don't know where he sourced that one from. No local museums have any record of Hoquiam rubies at all. And I don't know what happened to Poe's collection. He was affiliated with the American Museum of Natural History and the Carnegie Museum, but neither of those museums have his boules. Nassau said two boules were with people associated with the London Gemological Laboratory, which was maybe less vague in 1973. I think that became Gem A, and I tried another place as well, but the Brits haven't responded to my inquiries. I imagine the Smithsonian samples are still there because it's the Smithsonian, but I'm going to call out GEM's manager Russell Feather for never replying to my emails about them or anything else in the last year. Even if I'm right about the real story, historical precedent means these will forever be known as Hoquiam rubies. And that's okay. It's part of their story now. What's important is preserving the history of synthetic gemstones and maybe doing a little fact-checking along the way. Now, what about the future of flame fusion sapphires? I said modern Verneuil furnaces use the same approach as 100 years ago, so why aren't we all making ruby at home?
There are people who have, in fact, tried and have somewhat successfully done so. There are people who have made home arc welding furnaces to produce like really low grade sapphire and ruby at home. The one Russian setup that I'm familiar with that was able to produce consistent like boules produced fairly small ones, like in the 10 to 12 millimeter range. It's a very energy intensive process. Like it takes a lot of energy or it takes a lot of like compressed flammable gas to be able to do this at home, which is why nobody really tries. That's why like all of these home like chemistry nerds and like mineral nerds, when they try to grow their own crystals at home, they don't use this particular method. The issues are controlling the rate of the gas, controlling the rate of the powder, controlling the movement of the pedestal, and then insulation. But with a lot of modern machining techniques and with a readily available like commercial stuff, it's not very difficult.
After this initial attempt, there would be no U.S. production of synthetic gemstones until World War II. With European supplies cut off by the war, in 1942, in Indiana, Lind Air Products was contracted by the government to start large-scale laboratory-grown production. Lind Air was owned by the Union Carbide Corporation, and in another case for the circular nature of history, Union Carbide operated for years in Washougal, on the Washington side of the Columbia across from Portland. The Union Carbide plant was bought by Baltic Crystal and is now owned by Alox Technology, producing clear synthetic sapphire. I wonder if they know they're continuing a legacy of sapphire production in the state that started over 100 years ago. Now, Alox doesn't use the Verneuil method, but is anyone else?
The Russian that I was talking about is just like a single person out in the middle of nowhere in like near Moscow. Java was a Swiss producer that produced probably like a huge amount of the world's bulk. They went bankrupt in 2021 in part because a lot of lower quality firms that were government subsidized in, let's say, China and Thailand started undercutting them with lower quality production. Java produced their own oxygen and hydrogen in-house. They electrolyzed water, like they got like pure water, like did all this stuff themselves, like electrocuted it to split it into oxygen and hydrogen. So they had like their own internal purity standards, did everything to much more aggressive like quality control, that kind of stuff. The luxury synthetics market didn't really exist the way it does now. They sold all of their remaining, I believe, product and intellectual property rights to Rus Gems, which is now RG Crystals. And if I understand correctly, has moved from Russia to entirely Bangkok. They're still very heavily involved in the synthetics industry. They grow their own hydrothermal emeralds. They grow their own like other products.
Aria knew of more companies, but few do flame fusion growth for the synthetics market. The rubies grown by flame fusion are identical structurally and chemically to natural rubies. This is why we can say they're synthetic rubies and not ruby simulants. The terminology around lab-grown crystals is sometimes a hot topic and has led to confusion among the public and even gem cutters.
For some reason, there's this weird misconception that flame fusion rubies are somehow softer than rubies grown by other methods, which is totally untrue. There is an accurate representation that there will be an outside skin that forms, but that outside skin is usually just a little bit more concentrated in terms of color for ruby than on the inside of the boule. The hardness is still exactly the same, all that kind of stuff. The other misconception is that everybody seems to think that like you've got the boule, it's like a cylinder that goes upwards. Everybody seems to think that this upwards direction is the C-axis. It's not. It's nowhere close to it. When you have one of those split boules, so if you've got like, here's the splitting plane and here's like the curvy part. So think about a line going right up and down this way on that splitting plane and then tilt it. So here's that splitting plane, tilt it. I can't even remember how many degrees. I think it's like 40 degrees, whatever. Tilt it that way or tilt it that way. 14 indices on a 96 index. And that's where the actual C-axis is. And if you cut a facet that's directly on the C-axis, it will be much, much, much harder, like physically harder.
The gemstone market is bigger than just rubies. What else could Paul Richards have attempted to make with his long-shot Bellingham factory?
The two big ones are sapphire and spinel. And when we say like spinel from flame fusion, it's not actually spinel. You take the equivalent of powdered spinel and you add extra powdered sapphire to it to stabilize it. Just like cubic zirconia isn't actually cubic zirconia, it can be up to 20% yttrium by weight. Flame fusion spinel isn't actually spinel, it's stabilized by sapphire. Big things that are grown for the optics industry by flame fusion are strontium titanate, which is one of those exotic diamond-like synthetics, so super high refractive index, super high dispersion. and then synthetic rutile, so titanium oxide, and that has the highest refractive index and dispersion of any non-toxic mineral. Those are the other two things that are commonly produced by flame fusion. But there's a huge number of other things, like very experimental, like refractory ceramics and other interesting things that you can grow by flame fusion. So like barium titanate, or in certain conditions, you can do like other silicates that normally would be too sticky and thick to be able to grow properly. It's like a whole range of stuff, but nobody really does them in volume.
The cost of production and limited market means the intellectual property behind crystal growth is often a well-kept secret. But that also means when a company shutters its doors, that knowledge is at risk of being lost and it becomes more fodder for gem lore. Arya is working on what he calls the Verneuil project, an attempt to collect, characterize, and cut all the known types of sapphire and spinel boules.
Since maybe like 1910, there has been a consistent set of numeric codes assigned to all flame fusion production of sapphire and spinel. As best as I can tell, the earliest history of that matches Verneuil's initial experiments on coloring agents and things like that. So the start was rubies, like the first set of Verneuil production was all rubies. And then there was the next set was experimenting with different oxides as coloring agents. Then it was, I don't remember what the next one was. The fourth set, which is like number 30 through 39, is all trying to make blue sapphire. In the 40s, we're all looking at vanadium and like color changing sapphire. So there was like a systematic approach, at least early on, to producing flame fusion products. But nobody's ever bothered to characterize these. Like nobody has looked at the actual colors or like the gemology behind them or the concentration of like coloring agents. Nobody's done spectroscopy. Nobody's done standardized like production sets. Even when Java used to produce everything and do like sample sets that they would give to people, the stones weren't cut in the same orientation. They weren't cut with the same amount of like the external skin of one color. So nobody ever bothered to standardize these. Nobody ever really bothered to study them. And the actual like formula of coloring agents in the powders are obviously trade secrets. But this is really valuable information for us to have in gemology, because then you can look at a cut stone. If we have all this background information, you can look at a cut stone, run it through your spectra and your testing, whatever, and be able to say, this is Verneuil number 55 SP, which is a specific type of padparacha. Or you can look at it and say, this is Verneuil number 78, which is like a absurd cobalt green sapphire that just doesn't exist in nature. So since nobody's bothered to characterize these, we can't really do anything from a gemological perspective with interesting synthetics. And that's like a big deficit in gemological knowledge. So having that information would be able to let us progress the field, at least like the commercial side of the field of synthetic sapphire and spinel, quite a bit more. The long and short of the actual project is we have like almost a complete collection. We're trying to fill out the collection of the last remaining like Verneuil numbers. And then we're standard cutting everything, sending everything off for chemistry, sending everything off for spectroscopy, and then taking like color controlled standardized photography. So that way you have a client who's like, I want this color. You know, hey, I know exactly which number boule or which number boule and which heat treatments need to be applied.
It's fitting that the flame fusion codes have a history extending back to Verneuil himself. Arya plans to preserve that legacy, but also expand upon it, working with crystal growers to produce new and exciting colors. It's a bright, colorful future I'm looking forward to seeing grow, one boule at a time.
When we look at synthetic sapphires and spinels, there's a lot of coloring agents that just had never been tested in real life, like they just hadn't added them to things. So copper, for example, nobody's growing copper in sapphire, and that should be able to produce either very interesting colors or Paraiba-colored sapphire consistently. Nobody's ever looked at niobium. Nobody's ever looked at zirconium in sapphire, and we know that they should produce very interesting, very vivid colors, but nobody's bothered to grow them. So we're working on some experiments to grow these like unusual products. And then if you look at some of the other ones that have been used in the past, you look at nickel. Nickel, you add it to sapphire, produces this stupidly strong, like lovely yellow color. But if you heat it in hydrogen, it should turn this like very unusual blue-violet color that doesn't exist in any current synthetic sapphire. Well, so why hasn't anybody bothered to grow some of it deliberately? Why hasn't anybody bothered to heat treat it? So that's one of the other things we're looking at. The best padparacha that you should be able to get comes from manganese, but there's no, like absolutely 0% of anybody worldwide is growing sapphire with manganese in it. So, well, then let's grow it and study it and see what we need to do with it. I mean, I want weird, like weird, interesting synthetics. Like, there's a huge market for it. It just doesn't exist. Nobody's growing it.